Archives and History Library. As usual, we see a lot of familiar faces tonight, but I see some people that we don't see so often. Tonight, our speaker is Susan Scouras. She is an Archives and History Librarian and has been here for the last 13 years. She has a bachelor's degree in history and a master's in library science from the University of Kentucky, but we won't really hold that against her. And she has been interested in genealogy since she was a teenager. So working in the Archives and History Library and with archives collections is a daily pleasure for her. As our cataloger, Susan looks at a book or a pamphlet analytically in order to identify it, classify it, add subject headings to make the book findable by staff and patrons. But she also enjoys discovering what the printed piece can tell, reveal about its time period and the people who lived then. Susan often points out her discoveries to members of the staff, and her observations can come from a wide range of resources. This evening, that is what she hopes to show you about cookbooks. Cookbooks in our collection include those compiled and distributed by commercial publishers, church and civic groups, fundraisers, appliance and food manufacturers, and individuals. We hope when you go home tonight, you'll have a new respect for the assortment of recipes and cookbooks in your own collection. Before we get started, I want to point out, I probably did this in reverse order, on the 22nd of September, that is a Saturday, we are having a panel discussion on the Paint Creek, Cabot Creek strike. That is going to be a very interesting event, and you all may want to come in on a Saturday. The newspaper did not have the time listed, and that is at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. It will be in this room. On October the 2nd, Stan Baumgartner will be here to discuss postcards of Charleston, and that will be, of course, at 6 o'clock. Now, October is Archaeology Month, and we offered some dates to people over in Historic Preservation to have some folks come over and be part of our lecture series, and they took us up on 2 of those dates. On the 18th, Annette Erickson will be in to do a presentation on the W.C. Stiles Jr. Thornhill Estate site near the abandoned town of Volcano. Now, this town was founded by Stiles specifically to serve his oil business in the area. So it has some of those unique qualities that a company town would have. Ms. Erickson has led the Hocking College for the past 2 years doing archaeological excavation there, and I'm sure she'll have some very interesting observations. On the 25th of October, the McBrides are coming. They are archaeologists, and they will be giving an overview of frontier forts and their role in the defensive systems during the French and Indian War, Lord Dunmore's War, and the Revolutionary War. That's my time period. That's very dear to my heart, and that'll be very exciting, I think. And in November the 13th, a regular here who comes to listen to the lectures, as well as a regular patron of ours, Dr. Ken Bailey, will be here with a talk entitled Scratchum and Suum, Post-Civil War Legal Issues. And I don't know more than just the title, but that sounds extremely exciting, and that will be November the 13th. So without further ado, there's Ms. Scouras, and we'll hear about the cookbooks.
Hi, glad to see all of you. We'll start off first by talking about the types of cookbooks that are collected by the West Virginia Archives and History Library. That may not be the type of thing you would expect us to have. After all, the public libraries have a lot of cookbooks. The state library across the hall from us, the West Virginia Library Commission Library, has literally hundreds of cookbooks of all types. So the ones that we have are West Virginia related in some way. Primarily, we don't purchase cookbooks, but we do accept them gladly as donations. They need to be published by a West Virginia organization, have a West Virginian as an author, or have a West Virginia imprint, that is, they were published or printed in West Virginia. We also accept cookbooks that have an Appalachian emphasis, not just but the region. And they may also have a historical interest. They may not be a West Virginia author or publisher, but they may have been distributed by a West Virginia business or by the maker of a product widely used by West Virginians. And there are also things that, say, the really old cookbooks, the ones from the 1700s, the very early 1800s, they may have been considered standards of their time. So while they were not particularly associated with what is now West Virginia, they were still the books that people living here at that time would have had in their homes and referred to. Cookbooks also are our history. They're a part of our history, both social and political. The concept of social history is a relatively new one that largely grew out of the civil rights and women's rights movements in the mid-20th century. American and European history was based more on the actions of government, on political leaders, financial and manufacturing development, and the military, with maybe a little arts history and architecture thrown in. But basically, it left out the contributions of non-male, non-white people, as well as told nothing about the everyday lives of the populace. Cookbooks, with their food recipes, household hints, and advertisements, give us evidence and clues about what it took to feed a family and run a household in that given time period. The earlier the time period, the more time it took out of every day to grow, gather, preserve, and prepare food, to gather the fuel to provide the heat to cook that food, to concoct medicines and particular foods for the ill and the infirm, and to entertain guests when restaurants weren't an option. And in those days, your house guests stayed for days, if not weeks, and possibly even months. And at the same time, you had to make mostly all of your own cleaning products, whatever you needed for disinfecting, scenting, polishing, and scrubbing everything in your household. A farm wife especially could easily spend from dawn till dusk working in one way or another with food for her family and the farm workers. Before the advent of supermarkets and refrigeration, even a town or city housewife could also spend a major part of her day gathering fresh food from various vendors and preparing it. Political history can be gleaned from looking at food availability and pricing. In a particular time period, are imported items such as chocolate and coffee offered and affordable? Have import-export laws and taxes had an effect there? Have milk price supports affected the cost and quantity offered to consumers? A lot of times reading the newspaper, you'll see letters to the editor or various comment columns that bring up things you just never would have considered. One I was looking at recently from the early 1900s was going on and on about the availability of milk in the winter and the fact that government money was needed to buy hay for the milk cows when they couldn't eat grass in the wintertime. And if they didn't have the hay, they produced less milk, so there was less available for consumers and it cost more. There are other things more recent, like the Cuban Missile Crisis that resulted in a ban on imports from Cuba and caused a sugar shortage in the United States. Recipes based on wartime rationing, which was an attempt to distribute food fairly and prevent disruptions. And also manufacturing at that time was devoted to military needs, meaning that a lot of household items such as cook pots and wash tubs and stoves weren't being made. You had to make do with what you had. You could also look at the advertisements, see what's being offered for sale, and if things like cars and services for cars were being advertised in small town church cookbooks, then car ownership must have been a reasonably achievable goal for most people in that time, and that's an indication of a level of economic prosperity. Cookbooks are also interesting as a part of family history. Think about the types of cookbooks and handwritten recipes you may have found with your own family. Do they tell you how well your family ate, what food products were available to them, and where they obtained their food? The recipes may also indicate how much time and energy the cook of the household had to spend preparing meals and preserving food. Women who worked outside the home had less time to shop and less time to cook. Possibly a man was the primary cook in the household. Even if he wasn't the primary cook, he would have had a lot to do, especially on a farm, in the raising and preparing food to be cooked. Also, quite often in more urban areas, the husband did most of the shopping, if not the cooking. You can also see if recipes are indicative of either ethnic or other cultural influences. How much of their food did your family grow in a certain time period? Where did they prefer to shop? All of the details make a place and a time period in our families that were living there come to life for us. We can also talk a little bit about just what is West Virginia cooking. And I very luckily, when I was thinking about that, happened to look at the introduction to a cookbook called More Than Beans and Cornbread by Barbara Lori McCallum. And let me just read you her introduction because I think her words are better than any I could come up with. Texas chili, New England clam chowder, New York strip steak, Florida Gulf shrimp, Virginia smoked ham, California avocado salad, Boston baked beans, Alaskan king crab. All these mouth-watering foods come to mind when you think of regional specialties. So what do food fanciers associate with West Virginia? If anything, probably pinto beans and cornbread. A truth, but not the whole truth. First of all, you must take into account that after the Indians, the state's earliest immigrants came from, First of all, you must take into account that after the Indians, the state's earliest settlers were chiefly Anglo-Saxon, some say Celts, and Northern European. Later immigrants came from Middle and South Europe, from Asia and Africa. Economic opportunity for unskilled labor in the coal fields brought an influx of Southern Negroes after the Civil War. West Virginia is the only state born of this war, separating from Virginia in 1863. Mining also attracted people of Irish, Italian, and Hungarian extraction, and later industrial progress in chemicals and other fields brought highly skilled people from all over the globe. According to the 1990 census, the state's largest ethnic single ancestry groups were still English, German, Irish, and Italian, followed by Dutch, Polish, French, Hungarian, Greek, Russian, Norwegian, and Portuguese. Often touted as the most eastern of the western, western of the eastern, northern of the southern, and southern of the northern states, West Virginia's food reflects this diversity. Visitors to West Virginia's northern panhandle or western counties may think they're in Pennsylvania or Ohio. The southern counties are more like Kentucky, Tennessee, or North Carolina's mountain regions. Our eastern panhandle cannot be distinguished from Virginia, while the central counties remind one of the Midwestern farm states. Needless to say, this diversity brings a diversity in native dishes. Ethnic specialties were often adapted by nature's bounty of wild game and plants, or new dishes were created by necessity because of limited food supplies due to the state's isolation from major markets. Most people are not aware of West Virginia's large production of apples, peaches, poultry, even watercress, or that we celebrate with festivals such agricultural products as buckwheat, black walnuts, strawberries, molasses, and potatoes. Ewell Gibbons, the late natural foods guru, stated that West Virginia was, quote, nature's supermarket, end quote. All these factors add up to some mighty fine eating. Preserved here are typical down-home recipes, some converted to use with modern appliances and/or convenience products, which is not to say that West Virginia doesn't have its share of sophisticated cooks and dining places. After all, the Greenbrier is internationally known for its cuisine, and many culinary school graduates are chefs at various West Virginia restaurants. As a collector of West Virginia recipes for some 25 years, I often wondered why most of the cookbooks had few vegetable, salad, or main dish entrees, but huge sections on cakes, pies, and breads. But it makes sense. First of all, our pioneer ladies assumed that everyone knew how to make a good stew, roast a haunch of venison, or cook a turnip. Salads, which weren't even introduced until later, were nothing more than lettuce, tomatoes, and cucumbers from the garden, or perhaps native greens with hot bacon dressing. Their real accomplishments in the kitchen were measured by the tantalizing treats they shared at church socials, weddings, funerals, or entered in the county fair. So as a recipe was written down, it was one for Mama's jam cake or Aunt Sophie's pickle relish that was treasured and survived. I promise you old West Virginia family recipes to leave to your children and their children, the kind that celebrate a time when cooking and eating were ends in themselves, not just the joyless science it's becoming. So let's break bread, West by God Virginia style. You'll discover it's more than pinto beans and cornbread. So as I said, I think she said it much better than I could, and certainly covered all the bases. A lot of times what you'll see here in these books will refer to receipt. And receipt is a term meaning recipe. And if you look in a modern dictionary for the definition of the word receipt, the first definition is still recipe, although it's a term that has very much gone out of use. And I'm just going to dive in first here and just pull out some specific cookbooks to show you, and then look back over my notes and see if there's anything that I had meant to tell you about those cookbooks that I didn't. Most of the cookbooks that we have were published by West Virginia organizations, churches, ladies' clubs of different types, charitable groups, and probably most of them were produced as fundraisers. A lot of them may have been projects for an anniversary of some sort, and many of the cookbooks we have were for West Virginia's sesquicentennial, or for West Virginia's centennial, or for the bicentennial of the United States. I'm just going to go through these where I've pulled some out for notes. This cookbook called Mrs. Cooper's Encore is an ethnic cookbook with Jewish kosher recipes. It includes a lot of recipes for challah and bagels, and the cookbook author, Lillian Cooper, was apparently very well known for adapting bagel recipes in particular to make them at home. Bagels are not something that very many people make at home these days, but if you're used to getting bagels in an urban area, particularly up in the New York, New Jersey area, you really miss them when you come down to other parts of the country. So you might try to make my own. This one is called Dainty Dishes by Parkersburg Dames. It has a lot of interesting ads in it. There are also some recipes that the cook who owns the cookbook either wrote in here or stuck in. If we receive them like that, it depends how many are in there. If it's just a few, usually we'll leave them. If they've been taped, I'll try to remove the tape and maybe just put a little dot of acid-free glue in its place. If it's a really large collection, we'll pull it out and the archivist will put it in a special collections box and handle it separately. But this one is really loaded with advertisements. They made money both by selling the cookbooks and by selling ads and sponsorships in the cookbooks. And a lot of them really don't have a lot to do with cooking. but they'll give you a wide overview of what businesses were, viable in the community at that time. Yeah, these were the ladies of the First Methodist Episcopal Church in Parkersburg, and this was published in 1903. And the ones that can be handled, I'll pass them around. Take a look. This is one that falls in that kind of exception category of what we would accept. It's not specifically West Virginia, but these are the Farm Journal's friendly food gifts from your kitchen. And the Farm Journal would have been a publication received by, many of the households in West Virginia at that time. So, to have an idea of what might have been considered by West Virginia cooks in 1978, this is something that we would accept into the collection. This one's interesting, and one of these days when I got a little spare time around here, I might try to find out a little more about where this came from. It's a bride's cookbook, and it has a lot of ads in it too. But it says in the front, through the courtesy of Mr. J.M. Slack, our county clerk, this book is handed without obligation to you on your wedding day. And it's copyrighted 1934 in Charleston, and was compiled by a Charlestonian and published by the Rose City Press in Charleston. And there's a picture of the Kanawha County Clerk, Mr. J.M. Slack. So I'm just really curious as to whether they gave this just to people who were married at the courthouse. Did they, pass them out to everybody that got a marriage license? I'd not come across anything like that before, so if anybody else has heard of that type of thing, we'd love to know about it. And if you've got a copy of something like this, we'd love to see it. One of the things advertised for the new bride is a new range. There are a lot of things there in furniture. There are a lot of things there that they're hoping to sell. This particular one is a 75th anniversary cookbook for the First Baptist Church in Whitesville, celebrating 75 years from 1919 to 1994. And this being a more modern cookbook, you'll see that the contributors' names, if they're female, are their first and last names. All the way up into the 1960s, most often, if women were married, when their name was put in as a contributor, it was put in as Mrs. Walter Baker. It didn't say Jane Baker. And some of these, there may not be anything outstandingly of interest, but we'll just pass them around as samples of what we have. And if you find a recipe you'd like, there's a copy machine up here. 25 cents a copy. I thought this one was interesting. It's a Centennial sampler, 100 years of good cooking in Elkins, West Virginia and surrounding communities. And it was compiled by the American Association of University Women, Elkins branch in 1990. It's got a lot of tidbits of local history and information scattered all through it. Right here in the middle, there's a drawing and information about the West Virginia Children's Home. A lot of the recipes tell you a little bit of something about the person that made it or where they found the recipe. Now that I said that, I'm not seeing anymore. There's another building called the Round Barn, is the history of it. But there were a couple of really interesting comments about the people who baked the. This one talks about her mother made the best homemade bread once or twice a week, and that all the family remembers the holiday meals. Just a lot of nice comments like that. Those are the kind of things that, to flesh out your own family history instead of just names, dates, and places. Sharing meals is something that's very, very human, and something that most families enjoy doing together. Most of us remember holiday meals in particular, where we're gathered together with people we may not see all the time. Write down some of those things. Maybe pick a particularly interesting meal and describe what happened that day. What kind of foods were served, who made them, what was enjoyed the most, what was on the table that was on the table for every holiday meal. I particularly remember holiday meals and Sunday dinners at my grandparents' house. And one thing that's become a family legend is the fact that most of the time, at least one dish, not always the same one, usually the cranberry sauce, maybe the coleslaw, would get left in the refrigerator. And we would remember it at the end of the meal. But that was always just looked at, okay, that's something fresh to have with the leftovers, because everybody'd hang around all afternoon and you'd warm things up for dinner. At least, you'd have fresh coleslaw to go with it. But now when any of us host a family meal like that and something doesn't get served, it's just, it's a laugh that's shared because it's family tradition. I found this cookbook particularly interesting for myself. It's a West Virginia Centennial cookbook compiled by the Women's Club of Logan in 1963. And I happen to belong to the Greek Orthodox Church in Huntington, and a lot of the ladies that lived down in the Logan area were actually members of the church in Huntington. And a lot of them I never had the opportunity to meet, but some of their children or grandchildren had heard a lot about them. Well, this cookbook has a lot of their Greek recipes in it. And it was very interesting, for me to see their family recipes shared and carried on in this book. There are others, particularly from the Parkersburg area. Any type of book like this is going to have a lot of Italian recipes in it. You'll also see, like one Greek cake that I'm looking at here calls for 2 cups cream of wheat. Well, that's not the traditional Greek recipe, but when they came here, they couldn't buy the type of kind of granulated semolina flour that they were used to using in Greece. So that a lot of these Greek American recipes now, you'll see they've substituted something they could get here. There's another recipe that calls for shredded phyllo dough, which, unless you made it yourself, which is a very difficult and time-consuming process, you couldn't buy here. Even now, you can only find it frozen, maybe specialty stores. So they substituted shredded wheat. So there are a number of recipes for Greek dishes in particular, where if it's something that was common in their home country, they just found the closest substitute that they could find here. I like this one. It's called Mom and Ramps Forever. And it's by the same woman that wrote the More Than Beans and Cornbread, Barbara Burry McCallum. And she has a lot of different recipes here using ramps. And we'll just pass that one around, let you take a look. One of the first things I did when I started working here was clipping up some old newspapers. The newspapers had been microfilmed, and we went through the newspapers, clipped things we wanted to keep for the clipping files, and then recycled the rest. And I got to work on the West Virginia Hillbilly. Don't know how many of you are familiar with that paper. It hasn't, it passed away with Jim Comstock years ago. But he had quite a sense of humor, and he printed a special issue one year with ranch juice in the ink. And the post office sent them all back to him because they smelled so bad that the entire post office, the vehicles, everything else smelled of the ramps. and they refused to deliver them. So that was really my introduction to ramps, because even in eastern Kentucky, I don't remember ramps being served. So I think of that as a very West Virginia thing. And we have more than one recipe book like this one. It's called Sela Lerner's Viennese Cookings. And apparently this was after she'd spent 25 years at West Virginia State College. And she was well known at West Virginia State. And I think her husband was a professor there, but she fixed these grand Viennese style dinners for staff and students there. And I've seen a couple of cookbooks like this where someone was a very well-known cook in a particular area, and her recipes and her cooking advice would be compiled into a booklet. This is one of the few really new cookbooks that we have, kind of fell into our laps. It's authored by a chef named Susie Quick, who has a national reputation now. I'm sure she's been seen on the Food Channel and other places. It's for leaner, healthier foods, and modern cooking methods. Definitely not the same types of things you would see in most of the other cookbooks that we have. But we're pleased to have it, particularly an autographed copy, because she is a West Virginian. Something dear to my heart, because it was important to my mom when I was growing up, is University Home Extension Services. And besides the agricultural representatives that most people are familiar with, there were also extension homemakers. And they formed homemakers clubs around the state and taught classes in all kinds of food-related things, crafts, sewing. But their cookbooks, I think, are to be highly valued, because you have some of the best cooks represented in these cookbooks. This one was published in 1993, I think. And this one is called West Virginia's Treasured Recipes, a collection of early West Virginia food and philosophy. And this one was published in 1974. But you've got a wide variety of recipes here. This one is more aimed toward what they thought of as old-fashioned foods, and the other one probably is more has a more modern bent to it. But these are recipes contributed by women all around the state. This little booklet is by Dean Six, who's better known as a West Virginia glass expert. But this is called Cooking from Scratch, Time-Proven Classics from West Virginia Kitchens. And he gave us a copy of this when he was here a week or two ago to speak about glass. And he has such things as venison pie and fried squirrel. But he also has pumpkin cookies and West Virginia black walnut cake. And a very popular, I'm sure, recipe for fancy roasted possum and sweet potatoes. This cookbook's a little bit fragile, so I'm not going to pass this one around. This, again, is another one of the cookbooks that is kind of an exception to the West Virginia rule. It's the 20th Century Cookbook and Home Candy Making book. And they were distributed by A.W. Cox department stores, which were around the state. So these were probably commercial cookbooks that were probably sold and then a local cover put on it. But because this would have been distributed really all over the state and would have been used by a lot of West Virginia cooks, we've kept this as an example. This was published in 1921. And just an example of how things quite often happen around here. Serendipity is one of our favorite words. When I was looking for some newspaper pages to print out for food ads and things like that, I came across a column called Dishes for Today. It was in the Point Pleasant Register in 1936. And this particular one was about breakfast. It was about waffles. And it gave a couple of menus for breakfast. This one called for sliced oranges, crisp cereal with light cream, and creamed codfish on waffles. And while it gave recipes for different types of pancakes and waffles, it didn't give the recipe for creamed codfish, which kind of makes you think you were expected to know how to make that. Well, I opened this book up, and darn if I didn't open it up to a recipe for creamed codfish. 1.5 cups of hot milk, 1/8 of a teaspoon of pepper, 3 tablespoons of flour, and a cup of salted codfish flaked, and 1/2 a tablespoon of butter. And you basically make a milk gravy out of that. And this was from 1921, I think, didn't I say? 1921. So in 1936, people were still eating creamed codfish, and it was perfectly natural to have it on your waffles for breakfast. And this is another one of my favorite cookbooks, and it's a recent one by first name on here. Lucy Bennett Smooth, I think. Yes, Lucy Bennett Smooth. She, her granddaughter brought her in to present this book to us, and her family helped her put together a beautiful cookbook with photographs of how she ran her household, the things that she used to run her household, recipes for her best known dishes, comments in general about what her family learned from cooking with her in her kitchen. It's just a delightful book. And this is a really good example of combining family history with a cookbook. Our Archives and History News newsletter. You've read some excerpts from this book. It's called The Virginia Housewife or Methodical Cook, and it was written by Mrs. Mary Randolph. This particular edition was published in 1836. I think the original one was published sometime in the 1820s. But it is, in this little volume, a total book on household management, and even gives you advice as to, if you have servants and slaves, what you need to lock up and carry the keys in your pocket, how much to measure out for the cook to use to cook this or that. It just really gives extensive instructions for handling all types of food in all kinds of circumstances. What to cook for entertaining. And some of it's very basic. There's one here, how to boil potatoes and how to fry sliced potatoes. But we also have information on how to pickle sturgeon, how to cure bacon, how to bake a calf's head, how to broil calf's liver, stuff and roast calf's liver, and how to prepare rennet. I don't know how many people are familiar with rennet, but it's product made from the stomach lining of a cat. And it's used to, I guess one of the main reasons you use it is to curdle milk for various recipes. That's another thing, that there are many things that we buy without thinking from the store, that in those days there wasn't a store to go to, or at least it wasn't very easy, and there were many things that you had to have at home. Basically, they were chemicals used for cooking, or products that you had to make yourself, such as rennet from the cow's stomach. A lot of these early cookbooks included butchery, how to slaughter, trim, and prepare meat, how to cook, cut, and preserve every scrap of an animal or a fowl. And as the old saying about hogs go, they used everything but the squeal. Some of the ingredients you see in old recipes are not going to be familiar to you. One is isinglass, which is actually made from fish cartilage, and it's used to thicken a liquid, but leaving the liquid clear, unlike cloudy or opaque as flour would make it. And I guess today you could substitute cornstarch for that. Tartaric acid, which we would have on the grocery shelf in the form of cream of tartar, which is the tartaric acid mixed, I believe, with baking soda. And we don't even use cream of tartar that much anymore. People had to mix their own baking powder, their own baking soda. People also use lye and sulfur in cooking. Lye was used, the thing I can think of most often is to make hominy from corn. Sulfur was used as a preservative. Things like raisins and apples were often sulfured. They would create a little fire and put the sulfur on it to burn, and essentially would steam or smoke the product they wanted to preserve with the fumes from the sulfur. There are a lot of traditional and regional cooking recipes developed maybe by your own family, or tweaked in a traditional recipe that your family made their own in one way or another. A same grandmother that always forgot coleslaw or something in the fridge, they had moved away from the mountains and were more towards the Newgrass region. And I had never lived in the early part of my life in a period that I could remember truly in the mountains. And I thought my grandmother's chocolate gravy was the best stuff in the world. She also made cracker dressings, which was from crushed saltine crackers. And when she fixed the pork roast, she didn't roast it in the oven, she boiled it on top of the stove. And I thought these things were all kind of particular to my rather eccentric and really not all that inventive of a cook grandmother. Then later on as an adult, I moved to Pikeville, Kentucky, and lived there for a while. And, you know, would read the local paper with recipes and discussions of food and things like that. And come to find out, those were all variations of very traditional Appalachian recipes. And I hadn't had a clue all those years. I just thought they were things that my grandmother did, and didn't realize that she probably learned it from her mother, who learned it from her mother, and so on. And I still miss that chocolate gravy. Another thing that my grandmother did that amused us kids, because we weren't allowed to do it, she'd eat her dessert first. She'd get everybody else to bed, and she'd be the last one to sit down at the table, but she'd sit down with her piece of pie and go ahead and eat it. And she always said that her daddy had always eaten his dessert first, because as a miner, he was used to carrying his lunch pail into the mine, and the pie or cake or cookies would be on top of the lunch pail so that they wouldn't get crushed. So just for convenience, because they were on top of the pail, they would eat the dessert first. But my great-grandfather always said that you ate your dessert first in case the roof fell. At least that way you got your dessert. Cookbooks also gave a lot of instructions for preserving food, whether it was by canning that we might be more familiar with, or drying, ways of storing food. I've got a note here somewhere. Let's see if I can find it. One of the things, too, that was not common here, being as far inland as we are, was seafood and fish from the sea as opposed to the river or the lake. What we had here was limited to what you could get in a can, which was mostly shrimp, oysters, maybe anchovies and sardines, herring, maybe mackerel, and salmon and tuna. Although you don't see tuna as much in the older cookbooks as it's so common to us now. We think of it as a staple in the cabinet like peanut butter, but you don't see tuna nearly as much as you see salmon mentioned. And especially in the 20s and 30s, a lot of recipes called for canned lobster, which was something I wasn't familiar with. Fresh seafood really wasn't to be found much at all, because in those days they didn't freeze things and ship. What you would usually see were oysters brought in on the trains in barrels of ice, or packed in ice and straw. And a lot of local organizations would sponsor what they would call an oyster roast or an oyster feast. And I think the Catalogue Temple still does that here in town. But in those days, it was, you know, a limited time of the year that you could bring them in, and it was something that everyone looked forward to and enjoyed. Seasonal cycles also once dominated the availability and the quality of fresh vegetables and fruit. Now we import fruits and vegetables of all types almost all year round from around the world. Items such as potatoes, onions, turnips, and apples were one of the few things that could be stored for long periods of time without otherwise preserving them. And until recently, most people, I think, understood what we meant when you talked about storage and applied it to such food. Storage foods were what remained of last year's crop that were still in storage and were being used up as last year's crop was just being planted or wasn't yet harvested. Storage fruits and vegetables were somewhat dehydrated because they were old, and that had to be compensated for in the cooking. I like new potatoes when they first come out, but mashed potatoes, what you would call storage potatoes, I really prefer those because the flesh of the potato is not as wet, and it mashes easier, and you don't have as many lumps. Bakers once preferred older apples for making pies or stack cakes because they didn't have as much juice in them, and they were easier to cook with, where fresh apples were more preferred for applesauce. It kind of depended on how much juice the cook wanted to deal with. But we don't really deal with that now because we have fresh potatoes and apples and other things almost all year round. Preparing recipes from older cookbooks can take a little research to translate the terminology for some of the measurements as well as the ingredients. They'll talk about a lump of butter the size of a filbert, which is a hazelnut, or the size of a walnut, or of a hen egg. And you have to remember, too, hen eggs were a lot smaller those days than what we see commercially produced now. Flour and sugar might be given in terms of pounds or ounces rather than cups. There were descriptive terms for oven temperature, such as slow or hot. Cooking terms such as slow boil, rolling boil, or steep, which are not terms that we think about much today. When gas and electric stoves and range tops became available, cooking or baking heat may have been given as a number on the stove knob. This is something that's really quite common still in European cookbooks today. If you have a gas stove, you set it to number 6. And let's see, another little tidbit here. The first half of the 20th century, residents of coal towns usually had a company store and only a company-operated store in their community. The availability of credit kept many families fed in lower income months, but it also kept them from shopping elsewhere, where prices may have been lower and the selection better. The use of line company script rather than cash pay limited workers to the company store for shopping. Non-company stores sometimes would accept script, but only if they had an arrangement with the company to be reimbursed for it. And quite often there was a markup to the customer for that. Just a couple of other things we have here in that regard. If you think your family may have shopped at a company store, if you're just interested in that, we've got a book here that is about what it calls the industry store, which are stores that were sponsored by whatever the company was. And we also have a big set of books on script. And that includes lists of company stores, the name of the mining company in the town where they work. Here's just a couple. And you can come up and look at these after. This one is merchants tokens. These were not necessarily company store script. And this book is company store script in particular. And it has a list of, as I said, the coal companies in the towns. And we have several more books. Also, lumber companies quite often had company stores and script. Newspapers are another source of learning about food and cooking and recipes of the time. I just pulled the Point Pleasant Register because it's one of our older newspapers, and just took a sampling of what I could find there. In January of 1870, there were really very few ads for food or food stores. I've pulled a couple here and I'll pass these around. There is mention of a bakery which sells fresh bread, cakes, and pies. They also sold flour and they sold ale. There's another ad next to that for a meat market, but mostly the ads of this time period, and even as much as 50 years later, were promoting a particular grocer, a particular store, and urging you to trust that store to have the lowest prices, to provide you with the best goods. The ads very seldom listed a lot of specific goods and almost never listed goods and prices. One thing I thought about this ad was that among the listings of things they offered were glass fruit jars for canning. And a number of these you'll see, and a long ad here, you can see stuck in through the ad all the way down, it spells out Hoofland. That was German bitters, which were sold both as food and medicine. And when I was pulling almanacs as an example of places to find recipes, this almanac is Hoofland's Almanac from 1879. We had some older than this. Hoofland's Almanac and Family Receipt Book for everybody's use. And what they're trying to sell is Hoofland's medicine. So people were not only seeing this ad in the paper, they were receiving these almanacs that advertised for use at home. And you might flip through the almanac when it comes to you. There are, a number of recipes in it. And in looking at newspapers in the past, I have seen storekeepers that advertised they would buy eggs and butter. This particular one, also from 1870, Thomas L. Hale is on Main Street, Point Pleasant, and he said he's a dealer in staple groceries and provisions. He has sugar, syrups, molasses, coffees, teas, provisions, flour, fish, and pickles. And he said that he is not to be undersold by any other house in town. Give me a trial. The very bottom of his ad, it says the highest market price paid for country produce. So the stores in town were importing a lot of prepared foods, packaged foods, but they did buy produce and eggs and butter from local farmers to turn around and sell to townspeople that didn't raise their own. I looked at 1899, 1900, again in the Point Pleasant Register, and ads for groceries were few and far between. I pulled a couple here that I did find. One calls it the cheap grocery. It says, don't you know you can buy all kinds of groceries and provisions cheaper at S.W. Swisher's than you can at any other grocery in the city? He also said goods could be delivered to any part of town. Right next to it is an ad which has a big strawberry on it, and you might think it was to sell produce, but it was to sell seeds and plants to grow your own. Also from 1899, another ad for S.W. Swisher, and right below it, an ad for the competition, L.A. McMillis, who says he'll sell them cheaper than anyone else. Call and see. So it was more personalized. It was more, you know, which grocer did you come to know? Which grocer did you trust? You could go shop there and compare the prices yourself, but they weren't printed in the newspaper for you to compare. Let me jump up to 1936. You're still seeing, this is contrasted on the same page, you're still seeing some of those older type ads that are just real small ones, and this is blown up a great deal. In the real paper, this ad was only about that big. It says, get your groceries and meats at our store for the 4th. This is an ad for 4th of July. And that's basically all it says besides the name of the company. But right above that, things are starting to change. Here's an ad for Kroger's. You've now got regional or national chain stores beginning to move into the small towns. And this ad lists specific products and prices. I'll throw something else in here too because I found these in the papers. As electricity spread, as natural gas was piped and pressurized and more available, you begin to see more modern appliances being offered for sale in the papers. And you may or may not remember, but some of the largest sellers of appliances used to be the utility companies. You bought your furnace or your gas stove from the gas company. You bought your electric stove, your refrigerator from the electric company. And there's some ads here from the Point Pleasant Water and Light Company. And this one in particular is advertising a whole electrical appliance show, which apparently they've been doing. It says it's 2nd annual. And you know, it's showing all kinds of appliances, not just refrigerators and stoves, but lamps, vacuum cleaners, waffle irons. You also might take a look at this lovely stove, which says banished soil and toil banished from the kitchen by this hot point electric range. And there are, this and other ads will talk about how your pots stay shiny and bright, how you don't have to scrub your stove anymore, that your walls and your curtains will stay cleaner. A lot of things you don't think about if somebody's been cooking with a wood stove or even using coal in the stove. up to 1952, and that's when you start to see ads more like we're used to seeing. They're larger ads, they have prices, they list items by product, brand name, and you can look from one ad to the other and compare prices. And again, here you've got a local stores, but you've also got an A&P. And really from this time on, the ads begin to look more like what we're used to seeing today. You know, regular ads at least once a week, full page ads with a lot of specific information. We got really interested in recipes when we were searching the area newspapers, the West Virginia newspapers, for soldiers that died in service that were missed in the initial round or two for the West Virginia Veterans Memorial. We were going to have part of it be engraved, and we wanted to do it properly and made a push to get as many soldiers as we could find included. So we divided up the newspapers around the state among the staff and a volunteer or two, and we read the newspaper for every day of World War I and World War II. And, you know, there's a lot of sadness there and a lot of suffering, and I guess us women in particular, began to distract ourselves looking at the recipes, particularly since the recipes were trying to cope with rationing and were based on what foods were available. And we kind of had a contest after a while about who could find the most recipes for liver loaf. You know, all of the better cuts of meat were being processed and canned and sent overseas or fed to soldiers on bases here at home. And pretty much what was left for the general populace was the organ meats. Now, it probably wasn't as hard for people to eat those in the 1940s as it would be now, because, as I said before, you know, the old saying about the hog, they used everything but the squeal. So people were used to eating different types of meats, game meat, organ meats. And of course some of them were and still are regarded as delicacies in a lot of cultures. But these recipes didn't sit too well with our modern stomachs. And we had a whole stack of them in some of our moves here and there have gotten misplaced, as I said. But hopefully they'll come back to the surface, and we kind of had intentions of making an unofficial World War II cookbook featuring liver loaves. If you saw the newspaper article that was printed about the cookbooks, she quoted me as saying in there the one that kind of bothered me the most, and it still does, I keep picturing it. It was a recipe for liver meatballs, and you suspended them in lemon gelatin. And it just wasn't a pretty picture. There were ads in the newspaper, such as, "Where's your ration card?" to remind you to keep up with your ration cards. And especially as the war went on and things got more complicated and more difficult, the newspapers quite often printed columns. Okay, this is the ration card you should have, this is what it can be used for, this is the date, you know, you have to use it by. And then sometimes there would be recipes using those items or suggesting how to save rationed items, like that. And again, it shows cooks trying to be creative and make the best they could with what they had. Here, sweetened applesauce with liver pancakes. Brains scrambled with eggs. Veal hearts and noodles. Kidney saute. Individual liver loaves with bacon curls. And they tried to come up with different ways to use the vegetables that you could grow at home and turn them into hopefully a filling main course for a meal. There's a recipe here for bachelor squash loaf made with winter squash. And there's also a recipe for frosted pears, an icebox dessert. But right there in the middle is panned cabbage with cubed liver. You see a lot of advertisements for the products that were available for sale. Armour sold an awful lot of that liver and tried to come up with all different kinds of appetizing ways to serve it. This is for a Maine sardine burger using hand-made sardines. Liver hotcakes. And this is one we have a little trouble picturing too. The head of the column is called Peanut Butter Improves Potatoes. And it calls for stuffed baked potatoes with peanut butter, which maybe is good nutrition, but I'm not too sure my family would eat it. Let's see what else we have here. That's another chicken liver ring. Chicken livers are we're a little more used to. Liver roll with sausage. Here's one of the columns I talked about that it says ration roundup, and again it's describing which of your ration stamps to use and the date you have to use it by. And these kind of things would catch your eyes too. It's an advertisement for aprons, which you don't see very much anymore. And even the babies couldn't get away from it. Beech Nut is advertising they're making liver soup for babies again. Some of the other things we have, you'll also find a lot of the older cookbooks give recipes for a lot of alcoholic drinks to make at home. A lot of them, particularly in the older days, were mixed with milk to make punches. But we have a couple of books in the collections that tell you how to distill. This is a more modern one, and it's all about moonshine. It's got the history of it and tells you to be sure what's legal in your state and what's not. But you can distill a little hard liquor in some states as a home product. This book, on the other hand, I think must have been a classic of its time. It was printed in 1813. And it's called Hall's Distiller. And it says it's adapted to the use of farmers as well as distillers. But it gives really complete information, including what type of grain to grow in order to distill fine whiskeys and all other types of alcohol. And what I thought was cool about this one, it's the kind of thing that happens here all the time. I always look to see who these books belong to, and sometimes I'll do a Google name search or look in the census just to see who that person might have been. This book belonged to Lawrence A. Washington, who gave this book to Mr. Andrew Parks in 1817. And the advice below tells how to divide up your farm, how to plant your grain. So much corn, so much rye, so much buckwheat, and so on. So I did a search on those names, and the first thing that came up was actually right here in our own collection. We find that happens a lot of times. We'll search something on Google, and it just brings us right back to here. And it's an article in the old West Virginia Antiquarian Society's West Virginia Historical Magazine, and it has copies of legal documents at the time in here from the early 1800s. showing that Lawrence Washington was a salt maker. So he was one of the early entrepreneurs and financiers in this area. And where these agreements to make salt were written out, the person who attested to these documents, who witnessed the signatures, was Andrew Parks. So come around again, right back here to where we are. There are other things you can look at here that are interesting in general. If you want some idea of what type of products were available from outside that could be shipped in, we've only got one. There are a lot of different years out in the world. This is the 1897 Sears Catalogue. And a lot of these things were offered in large quantities, but the catalog suggested a lot of places that you club together with your friends and neighbors and place an order to divide up the larger quantities and to share on shipping. And they have a grocery department. And a lot of things like tea, coffee, spices, chocolate and cocoa were offered here, as well as a lot of canned foods. We'll leave these up here. You can take a look later if you'd like. And this has also been featured in excerpts in Archives and History News. This is the Confederate Receipt Book, a compilation of over 100 recipes. Part of the title is worn off here, but basically they were adapted to the war, to what was available in the war. So it gives recipes to make things or to make substitutes for things that, foodstuffs that were not available because of the disruptions of the war. It also gives hints for making soap and candles when you can't buy them and you don't have all the ingredients you would usually have. And there's a whole section on remedies. You will find that in a lot of cookbooks. There will be recipes for cough syrups and liniments, and whole sections on food for the infirm, for the invalid. You know, milk toast, beef tea, calf's jelly, different things that were thought to be good for the stomach of someone that was ill. And this is kind of fragile. I'm going to leave these here. You can come up and look after if you like. This one is definitely an item of its time and not of the modern day, but it was, again, it's one of our exceptions. It's not West Virginia, but we've kept it as being indicative of the time that it was printed. It's called Miss Minerva's Cookbook, and by Emma Speed Sampson. And Miss Sampson had written a number of books of this type. This one's copyrighted 1931. But they're written as if the subtitle is "The Way to a Man's Heart," and there's a mammy-type figure on the cover. And a lot of the illustrations are in that regard, and the whole book is written as if it were in a less literate person's Southern English. Some of the recipes are pretty interesting, though. But again, we have that as an example of that time period. Something that is of interest to a lot of people these days is natural foods or wild foods, things you can find out in the wild. And we have a number of books that apply to that regard. There's one here about mushrooms. This one is a compilation of edible wild plants of West Virginia. This one's Wild Foods of Appalachia. Complete Guide to Edible Plants, Mushrooms, Fruits, and Nuts, How to Find, Identify, and Cook Them, and How to Know Wild Fruits, A Guide to Plants When Not in Flower by Means of Fruit and Leaf. comes in and uses these. Who relies on these as a lot in their research? Native American reenactors. And, you know, other people reenacting, I guess you'd say, less civilized times when people had to rely on what they could find in the wild for a part of their foodstuffs. Some of the things I find interesting too are books on different types of tools and gadgets. This is one for things used in cooking. We also have books that describe, this one's called Never Done, A History of American Housework, and talks about, you know, what was available. First of all, what had to be kept, what type of housekeeping had to be done in different time periods, what tools were available to do it with. And while things very seldom actually talk about it, one of the things I like to look at it and try to determine is what was perceived as clean. What was a clean house in that time period? You know, what was acceptable? What was so common to everyone that if, say, you had some smoke over the fireplace, or as the ad for the electric stove talked about, you know, you've got grease on your wall and you know, smoke on your curtains and that type of thing. So, you know, what made a clean house in that time period? Sometimes it's a little hard to tell. And these things all go hand in hand. You know, if the housekeeper, the cook, was having to do all these other things, then, you know, how were they managing to do all their cooking around it? What types of foods were they serving? You know, just how did they manage their time with what was necessary to keep their family fed? Yeah, there's a couple of more of the same type of book here. This one's called Housekeeping in Old Virginia, and it's a reprint of a book from the 1700s. And this is a cooperative extension book called Adventures in Good Living, which is the same type of thing. So it can give you an idea. This one's from 1972. And it starts with, as it says, the early years to 1926, kind of breaks it into time periods. So you can get some idea of, for a woman in particular, what was expected of her, what was the standard she was supposed to meet. A lot of them had poetry or little thoughts in there. We've got enough time. This is a recipe for cooking husbands. This is out of the Choice Receipts in Cooking that was distributed by the Baptist Ladies Aid Society in Mount Hope, Virginia. It says, a good many husbands are utterly spoiled by mismanagement. Some women go about as if their husbands were bladders and blow them up. Others keep them constantly in hot water. Others let them freeze by their carelessness and indifference. Some keep them in a stew by irritating ways and words, while others roast them. It cannot be supposed that any husband will be tender and good managed in this way, but they are delicious when properly treated. In selecting your husband, you should not be guided by the silvery appearance, as in buying a mackerel, nor by the golden tint, as if you wanted salmon. Be sure to select him yourself, as tastes differ. Do not go to market for him, as the best are always brought to your door. It is far better to have none, unless you will patiently learn how to cook. Preserving cattle of finest porcelain is best, but if you have nothing else but an earthen pipkin, it will do with care. See that the linen in which you wrap him is nicely washed and mended, with required number of buttons and strings sewed on. Tie him in the kettle by a strong silk cord called comfort, as the one called duty is apt to be weak. Make a clear, steady fire out of love, neatness, and cheerfulness. Set him as near to this as seems to agree with him. If he sputters and fizzes, do not be anxious. Some husbands do this until they are quite done. Add a little sugar in the form of what confectioners call kisses, but no pepper or vinegar on any account. A little spice improves him, but it must be used with judgment. Do not stick any sharp instruments in him to see if he's becoming tender. Stir him gently, watching the while lest he lie too flat and close to the kettle and so become useless. You cannot fail to know when he is done. If thus treated, you will find him very relishable, agreeing nicely with you and the children, and he will keep as long as you want unless you become careless and set him in too cool a place. Now, I think if you take a look at the pictures of the ladies in that Sunday school class, I just find it a hoot that that's the very thing they started off their cookbook. There are also a lot of oyster recipes in here, as I mentioned before, and it also has household hints. Sometimes I think the advertisers thought they were being funny, but I'm not so sure that the housewives that had the books would agree. This was not in very good shape. It's the Temple Cookbook. I think it was the Baptist Temple here in town. But one of the ads, it's dated like 1907, 1908. And one of the advertisers in there says, when the cook fails, call them for ice cream sherbets or water ices. I don't think, this was in the very beginning of the cookbook. I didn't think that was a very auspicious start to a cookbook to talk about a cook failing. And I'm not so sure that the cook would think that was particularly flattering. This cookbook also, even though it was small, had several pages in the back of foods for invalids. Beef juice, beef tea, milk gruel with oatmeal, mutton broth, unfermented grape juice. Let me see if there's anything really important that I left out. Well, I just think mostly one of the things I look at is when the groups put these cookbooks together, the range of people that participated. Some of them you can tell were, like the Sunday school classes, were very young women all the way up to very elderly women. Some of the more modern cookbooks, you know, the Charleston ones or whatever town you're from, will probably recognize people as being prominent in business and society, mixed in there with the ordinary everyday person. And it's interesting sometimes to think of these people working together for a common project. It's just, you have to wonder sometimes when you look at the recipes too, is that something they really cooked, or were they just trying to put in something impressive? And it's really hard to tell, but in the 1930s, I'd wondered that about a recipe that called for canned lobster, but then as I went through the cookbook, there were 2 or 3 more. So, you know, that tells me that canned lobster was a very common thing in that time period, and that people used it in their cooking. I can't think of any modern examples right off, but maybe something with caviar today. You might look in that same regard. Whereas if it were printed in a country where caviar was more common, you know, it would be a different matter than a country where it's considered only very ritzy for the way it's too expensive for the average person to buy. Seafood was like that. You know, there were a lot of parts of the country where that, you know, the local people relied heavily on seafood as a ordinary part of their diet, where in parts of the country where it had to be imported, it was very expensive and was a rare treat if you could afford it at all. I'm going to stop there. I can keep going. Anybody have any questions? Any comments? organizations or churches that have put out cookbooks or are thinking about putting out cookbooks, we'd love to have a copy. Somebody in your family might come 50 years from now and be delighted to find your recipe in there. Shelves. We'll just ask that you not bother anything on the bottom shelf.